Hi everyone, my name is Patrick Mason. I teach religious studies and history at Utah State University. And I want to talk about an anniversary. In some ways, it's a tragic anniversary. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. That, of course, is really one of the dark moments in modern American history. But the night before he was shot and killed, April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King delivered a sermon called "I See the Promised Land." Now, he didn't know this was going to be the last sermon he ever gave, but I think this is one of really his great sermons. So I want to talk about this sermon, why he gave it, what he was doing in Memphis, Tennessee, and then maybe how it speaks to us today in 2025. And so normally when we talk about Martin Luther King, we think about him as the leader of the civil rights movement, right? Fighting against Jim Crow and segregation and discrimination against African Americans. And of course, that's much of what defined his career. But especially in his later years, Martin Luther King came to see the struggle for freedom and justice in America as more than just a race issue. He said it's more than just about African Americans. It's about all people who are struggling for their dignity, struggling for justice and equality. And so in early 1968 in Memphis, the sanitation workers were in a conflict with the city government. They were in a conflict over wages and working conditions and so forth. And so Martin Luther King went to Memphis to support these sanitation workers, who were really standing up for their rights, standing up for their dignity. And on April 3rd, when King was there in town, they hold this big mass meeting in a black church called Mason Temple. And of course, King was the keynote speaker. He was the big attraction. He was everybody who was, he was the one that everybody was coming to see. And so I just want to talk about some of the words that he spoke in this sermon that, again, we know now turned out to be the last words that he would ever speak in public. And so he started the message by saying, the nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. There's confusion all around. But I know somehow that only when it's dark enough can you see the stars. And I think this is classic Martin Luther King in the sense that he always has this clear-eyed realism about the challenges, that we face, the injustice that is around us in society, but it's always paired with hope. It's always paired with this optimism that we can work on this, that we can get better. And he says, we as a society, we've been forced to a point where we have to grapple with problems that maybe have been lying around for a while, that maybe we haven't fully grappled with. There comes a point, a kind of crisis point, where we have to say, what do we really believe? And are we going to fight for these things? And for Martin Luther King in the sermon, he said, it's no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence in the world. It's between nonviolence and non-existence. He said, given, of course, this was at the high point of the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, but he said even here domestically, like how we're going to engage with one another. How are we going to be citizens of a pluralistic democracy? Are we going to find ways to do this nonviolently? If not, then the question is, can this country really survive? And he said, fundamentally, this is an issue of injustice. Again, you could point to the particular issues, whether it be the sanitation workers' issues or the kind of racial injustice that Martin Luther King had addressed for so many years in places like Selma and Birmingham and Montgomery. But throughout his life, and I think what made King so powerful is that he asked America to do nothing more but to live up to its own values. This was his message in the I Have a Dream speech, right? The sense that that there was a promissory note given to us in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And he said, what we're asking for when we call for justice, when we call for freedom, when we call for equality, is simply nothing more than the principles that the nation is founded on, the things that the nation has promised its citizens through the centuries. And so this is a refrain that he would preach, again, even on the very night before he died. And he said, if we're going to do this, then we have to develop what he calls dangerous unselfishness. And he taught this principle by appealing to a story in the Bible, in the New Testament. Now, we oftentimes think about King just as a civil rights leader, and of course he was that. But before that, he was a preacher. He was a pastor. He was a minister. He was a son of the black church. And so he went to this story that Jesus told called the Good Samaritan. It's one of Jesus's most famous stories. So this guy is beaten up on the side of the road. He's there bleeding. He's lying there helpless. And these two people pass by, and these are religious leaders. These are very holy people. They're the kinds of people that you would expect to help him, but they just walk by because they're afraid, or they don't want to be tainted or polluted, or they've got somewhere else to go. And then the third person to walk by is a Samaritan, and Samaritans and Jews were enemies. They were racial and ethnic and political enemies, but it's this Samaritan who reaches down, helps this guy, gets him to an inn, takes care of him, and Jesus says, we should all be like that Good Samaritan. And so Martin Luther King, in teaching this story, says, the first question that the Levite, this very righteous person, this religious leader, asked as he was walking by is, if I stop to help this man, what'll happen to me? Right? Is this really a con job? Is he going to rob me? Is he going to attack me? Or am I going to get sort of besmirched by this? But he says, actually, the Good Samaritan asks the right question, which is not what will happen to me, but if I don't help this man, what will happen to him? And that's the question that King wants each of us to ask. If I don't help out with freedom and justice and equality and democracy and peace, if I don't do it, what will happen, not just to myself, but to others? And as King winds up, this is the final paragraph in his sermon. These are literally the last words that he spoke in public, his last speech, his last sermon. And they're really prescient. They're really prophetic, and they're worth reading. He says, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anyone, I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, right? How poignant is that? But I want you to know that tonight, we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And so Martin Luther King said he didn't know if he was going to get there. He didn't know if he would be with America as America lived up to its best promises, as it lived up to its promises of freedom and equality and justice and democracy. But he said, I have confidence that we as a people will do that. And I think that is the lasting legacy of Martin Luther King. Of course, he didn't get there with us, but he helped point the way, along with so many others who pointed the way to justice. And unfortunately, we know what happened the next day, that he's out on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, and he's shot and killed. And, just short of 40 years old, and in a life snuffed out far too early. I think there have been lots of tributes to Martin Luther King. One of my favorite, that very much talks about this, and it is in the spirit of this final sermon, is a song, actually a pair of songs that were written by the Irish band U2. So maybe you can click on this and watch this. But I think this is an anniversary for us to remember the work of Dr. King, the message of Dr. King, and most of all, the hope that he gave us, that we can work together in the pursuit of greater justice and peace and democracy and freedom for all.